This week's content is going to continue working on the literary terms that we examined last week, as well as the story that we read for Edgar Allan Poe called The Telltale Heart. So let's very briefly take a look at the literary terms to make sure that we fully understood what they were. We'll take a look and very briefly recap some of the information that we remember from The Telltale Heart, and then we're going to move together into an outline. The reason and the purpose behind doing this particular type of essay as we finish up the semester is most students in this course are actually at the last level of developmental writing. So with that being said, I want to have students as prepared as possible for the types of short stories that you'll read, the types of literary terms that you're going to be faced with, and how to pull that short story, these literary terms, pull them into a successful 5-paragraph essay. By the time you finish today, we're going to outline everything, make sure that you're good and well on your way to be able to write that 5-paragraph essay as a rough draft this week. So theme. The theme is the message the writer uses in the story to convey, it uses to convey something about life in general. So some strategies to be able to discover what the theme is that students need to be able to know, who is the main character, identify the conflict, know how the conflict is resolved, and then generalize what the writer is saying overall. Instead of it being called a summary, this really is called a theme, and it's the plot of the entire short story. And usually writers have to be able to quickly ascertain what the theme is in usually about 2 to 3 sentences. It cannot be a long reflective paragraph. It does not include pronouns such as I, me, or my. It's directly a reflection of the story. So another term that we did take a look at was protagonist and antagonist. Remember, the protagonist is the principal character in a literary work. All right. And then the antagonist is the principal character who's in opposition. And when we start working on the outline here in a moment, we're going to look at these more in depth to make sure you fully understand what is expected for the essay. We also looked at tone and diction. Now remember, tone is the attitude toward the subject. The subject for The Telltale Heart is going to be the narrator, and also the attitude and feelings toward the audience. What's implied, what is suggested in the literary work. It can be formal, very informal. It can be kind of an intimate feeling between, the narrator and then the audience member itself, playful, serious. And also look at, how the theme is approached within the work. Diction is really going to be the distinctive tone of the author's writings, such as, what choice of words. Is it a positive connotation? Are the wordings that the author is saying very positive? Is the wording that the author, played out as the narrator or the character, very negative? Are the words negative? Do they give off that feeling like a very solemn and serious? And if you know the authors, what we looked at last week, you'll know that Edgar Allan Poe was many consider the first horror writer from the 1800s. So that's going to have a play and an effect in the tone and the diction that's used. Then the symbolism. There were several pieces of symbolism that were used in the book, or excuse me, not the book, but the short story. You have to think about, what about the vulture eye? The vulture eye is a symbol of what? What does the narrator see that the symbol eye, vulture eye is? What do they, when he sees it, what is he really seeing? Is it really an eye that he's seeing? Or does he see something beyond that? The last two concepts that I really kind of push together and tell students when you're writing, really push these two terms together. So one is dramatic irony. And really, dramatic irony is, what is the reader seeing from the narrator that the other characters in the short story can't see? What are they seeing? And last, foreshadowing. What information in the story is being projected that something bad's going to happen? So many a times when students are reading a story, they'll get kind of a feeling like something uneasy is going to happen. Words or statements by the protagonist, the main character, will allude and imply that something is going to happen. So Outside of looking at those literary terms last week, students read the story, The Telltale Heart. I gave you several resources for you to be able to interpret that particular short story. And don't be afraid to do that when you go into English 1301. If you're given a short story by your instructor and you don't fully comprehend the story, go to the internet to be able to help you pick apart the story. See if you can watch videos of people doing plays of the story. Go in and see if there are notes, like cliff notes, that will help you interpret and understand. I do the same thing when I read some short stories, because at times I'm not fully understanding everything it wants to say. I do understand some, but sometimes there are parts that I'm just not seeing deep enough to be able to look at everything. So here we are at the crest of what is the task that you're being asked to do. So this week students are going to write a full 5-paragraph rough draft of a literary analysis of The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. So you have a lot of work to be able to do this week. So you're going to take the story and these terms, and we're going to pull them together into a 5-paragraph essay. So there is good news of this. Because you're specifically looking at a short story, there's not going to be any need for students to go outside of the story to pull resources or go do more research, because everything you need are going to be these terms and then also going to be the story itself. So you're not going to be doing much research, but we're going to go ahead and work together on an outline so I can guide you in the direction, because this, for most students, is the first time that they have pulled a short story and these terms together. So I'm going to escape out of this, and let's open up a Microsoft Word document so that we can work together. I like to work in a Microsoft Word document. It's just easier. Students can be able to see it, and even though things may change, it's still, I'm a very linear thinker. Put story A, B, and C, and D together. So I know that not all students work that way, but we'll do the best we can. All right, so what do we know about a 5-paragraph essay? We know that we have an introduction, and we know that we have a body 1 paragraph. So, and this structure is not changing from what you've done before. We're not going to suddenly discover brand new paragraphs that have existed out there that we've never looked at before. I want students to be able to understand that your consistency of your 5-body paragraph is pretty consistent. You've still got the intro, 3 body paragraphs, and then a conclusion. So now that we know that those are pretty consistent, let's break down the introduction a little bit more. All right. So our first sentence of an introduction is what's known as the grabber sentence. Now remember, this is a sentence that pulls the reader into wanting to read more. Do keep in mind, when you're only pulling together literary terms and then you're pulling together a short story, it's not always going to be terribly interesting. Sometimes it's just an introduction for the reader to the story. So I might write a grabber sentence that says, in the story, The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, and then go forward from there. The insanity of a man is questioned. Just something of that, so something to pull the reader in. Now here, for the introduction, we've met the grabber sentence. Instead of doing background information of the topic, we're actually going to look at the theme. So here's one of those literary terms. The theme is, what is the short story about? This is where you, as the writer, tell me, as the reader, what was the gist of the overall short story. It is a little bit more difficult than most students perceive, because you've only got 2 to 3 sentences to tell me everything that happened in that story. And how many sentences does that story really have? A lot. So you're taking a lot of information and you're condensing it down. So you've got these 2 to 3 sentences that you need to do this. And the last piece that is extremely important, and it hasn't changed, is a thesis statement. This is where the writer tells the reader what is the central idea of this essay. This is where you actually get to put yourself in there. And I don't mean by using the pronouns of I, me, or my. What I really mean is that you get to assert how you feel about what you read. So I'm going to give you an example. I do not want students to use my example for their own. So I might say, in this short story, the narrator displayed, and I'm using past tense because this story has already happened, and you will probably need to do the same for your own, is it needs to be in past tense. The narrator displayed mental issues which caused him to kill the old man and his okay. So this might be my thesis. I probably actually have to go back and clean it up, but at least gets me started. At least for a rough draft, it gets me started. All right. So not a whole bunch has changed from what we've done in the past. You've got a grabber sentence, a theme, a thesis statement. Now here's a strong suggestion, and you don't have to follow it this way, but we have literary terms that we have to be able to address. When you go into your English 1301 class, your instructor is going to say, all right, well, we read this short story, and you need to tell me who the protagonist is, the antagonist, symbolism, etc., etc. And you need to tell me all of this and write an essay about it. Well, what you do is you take all the terms they've given you, and you take the short story, and then you break it down to see what relationships. So here's a strong suggestion as we go into this, is the students need to have the protagonist, they need to discuss the antagonist. Spelling is not my strong suit. And then you also need to talk about tone and diction in your body one paragraph. So let's talk about protagonist. In the story, who is the protagonist? Who is the main character? So if you hadn't already guessed, the main character is actually the narrator. And never in the story does Edgar Allan Poe actually give a name for the narrator. He's just known as the narrator. And so with that being said, we now have identified who this narrator is. So who is against the narrator? Who is in opposition? Because that's what the antagonist is. Many of my students have said the old man. And I said, well, that's true, but what specifically about the old man is in opposition, or what's the opposing force for the protagonist? And they went on to say, you know, the vulture eye. Now, is it anything that this man did wrong with his vulture eye? Likely not. I actually had a student comment that they thought perhaps that the old man had glaucoma or cataracts, so it may have been a medical condition. So as you'll go through, we as a reader can see that the narrator is not of sound mind, and so he really thinks it's this evil that's lurking at him through an eye. So in addition to telling me who the protagonist and antagonist is in the body one paragraph, you need to tell me the tone for each of the characters and the diction, and go back into your literary terms and the definitions, and go back and review what those are. You know, what are the attitudes and feelings, and what is said? Can you give examples of what is said in that short story to back up what you're telling me? There's nothing wrong with using information from the story. If you quote it, then you have to be able to cite the information as the story from Poe and what page you got it from or website. But using that is actually good evidence to show that you understand and are pulling these two pieces together. So let's take a look at body paragraph 2. So another literary term is symbolism. So let me give you some examples of some symbolism that we saw in there, and you can go back and be able to pull this into your body paragraph too. So one example is the vulture eye. Now for this man, the old man who is the antagonist, did he consider that he had a vulture eye? Well, no, he didn't. To the narrator, it's a vulture eye, and he's not thinking of a bird. When we think of the vulture, what do we think? With a dirty bird, it eats, it eats death, more or less, those, roadkill, as we call it. But when people think of a vulture, they think of it as evil. So really, that vulture eye, it symbolized evil to the narrator. And if you go back and read it, you can see some of the wording and quotes that he says that, typify that he is thinking it's evil. It's not him, it's the eye. The eye has caused him evil. All right, so to the narrator, the eye is a symbolism of evil. And another example would be the lantern. Remember, as going through the story, he talks about, every night that he goes in and he shines a light. So the light is, the goodness that is there. And so he shines the light on the man until one night the light happens to fall upon the old man's eye. And so it basically stimulated him to want to kill the old man. And so there are other symbolism pieces that are used. Go through and be able to read and pick out objects or things inside the story that stand for something else. And I always encourage my students, think outside the box when you're thinking about symbolism, because symbolism is a difficult topic in itself. But in itself, students just have to think beyond what they see. What does that really mean? What does this stand for? Okay? All right, so let's look at our last body paragraph. So we've done really well. We've talked about theme up here. We've introduced 3 of our terms here: protagonist, antagonist, tone and diction, symbolism. Okay, so the last body paragraph, let's take a look at dramatic irony, and the last one, foreshadowing. I really like for students to be able to pull these 2 terms together because they really match each other, so they kind of complement one another. So remember, dramatic irony is really taking a look at how is the narrator giving information to the reader that the other characters cannot see. In the second paragraph, if you go back and you read in the second paragraph of The Telltale Heart, you will notice that he goes in to talk about the vulture eye. Oh, the man does nothing to me. But what he doesn't know is that his eye is, I must think about it, and cautiously, finally, I'm going to kill him and thus kill the eye. If someone told you that they're going to kill someone, is their wording not to the person that they intend to kill, verse a short story, is that information privy to the person that he's going to act upon? Well, no. We as the reader are able to get inside the mind. He even says that he's not a madman. We as the reader, if most of you were reading that story with me last week, you're pretty much like, this man is mad. The narrator is just off his rocker. Well, we think so, but does the old man think so? Well, no, he doesn't get to see those words inside of his head. We as the reader get to see them. So write about information that the narrator portrays to the reader as the old man doesn't get to see. Something that portrays more beyond the characters. And last, foreshadowing really falls into line with that. Foreshadowing is like predicting the words that he's saying. He's saying that he's, going to get rid of the vulture eye. Well, you're not going to pluck somebody's eye out. You're going to, as he further carries out, he's going to kill the old man. And so we get a glimpse of this, and it's predicted that he's going to act upon this as he goes in cautiously night after night until, the 8th night he acts upon it. So foreshadowing is a prediction of actions that are carried out. So last we come into the conclusion paragraph. Now remember, your conclusion paragraph, it really is the ability to summarize the literary terms that we've addressed, because that was a whole focus. When your instructor asks you to write, they're going to say, here's your short story, here are the literary terms, you need to pull it all together. All right, so you need to address the literary terms, make it brief. And you can't rewrite the whole thing all over again into a conclusion paragraph, so briefly summarize. Even probably hit the high points of what you found most interesting. All right, and then give a final thought. What do you really feel about it? Do you really feel that the narrator is a deranged, delusional man, and the author, Edgar Allan Poe, fits right along with him because of these crazy stories he writes? Remember, I do not, and I will tell you again if I see it in your rough draft, do not put I, me, or my. You need to write as third person. You are the reader. That's who you are, the reader, okay? Because you read the story and you're now writing about the story. You're not rewriting the story. You are synthesizing and understanding what you read based off of these terms. So let me minimize this. Hopefully we can pull everything into one. This really should give students a good idea of what is expected. I'm not going to put this inside of Blackboard. I'll put the presentation, but I'm not putting this because truly I expect students to watch this and get this information without me having to, spoon feed students. But I want you to be able to understand these pieces, because when you are given another short story and these same terms, regardless of what English class you go to, that you can always structure it in this piece. Find things that are common, put them together beautifully, spell out exactly the way that things occurred with some underlying information. Think outside the box, be creative, and let us know exactly how you feel. So remember, by next week, students have to have their full rough draft. Please contact me if you have any questions or any concerns.